You're watching the Creator Channel. Please like the video and subscribe.
High King Torrhen did not sail east to inspect the provinces first. He turned instead toward Pentos, choosing to study the gate before stepping fully into the eastern house. That decision surprised men in Crown Hill, but it was not a soft one. Pentos sat closer to Westeros than the deeper eastern powers, rich, mannered, watchful, and full of those polished habits that can make a city seem harmless, right up until one notices who controls the harbor books, the feasts, the singers, the loans, and the doors. Torrhen wanted to understand that world from inside its walls before dealing further with the harder eastern blocks beyond it. So he went with a measured royal party, enough guards for dignity, enough scribes for business, enough discretion that the visit could still pretend to be hospitality rather than reconnaissance. The city pleased him at once, though not in a simple way. Pentos was large, walled, and alive with trade, square towers, tiled roofs, crowded harbour slips, broad manse districts, bazaars thick with cloth, amber wines, dyed beards, forked fashions, musicians, and hired charm. It had the look of a place that sold refinement, while hiding its fear under perfume and wealth. Torrhen noticed the contrast quickly. The harbour moved well. The manses were handsome. The feast halls were full. Yet beneath the elegance sat a city long accustomed to surviving by negotiation, bribery, spectacle, and making stronger men feel welcomed rather than resisted. The host for those 2 weeks was the man-styled Prince of Pentos, known more quietly and more accurately among the serious men as Bracharo Bararion, the figure later called the Tattered Prince. He had survived the magisters of this day, and turned 3 connected zones into his own sphere of influence, Pentos, Hiru, and the Maiden Plains, each useful to him in a different way. Pentos gave him harbor, culture, and foreign standing. Hiru gave him movement inland and controlled exchange across the lower approaches. The Maiden Plains gave him the sort of pleasures and industries that respectable rulers publicly condemned and privately taxed. Bracharo received Torrhen with all the layered grace Pentos was famous for. There were musicians in the upper courts, actors and singers in the feast halls, market routes opened for royal inspection, and long tables laid out with pale amber wine, sweet figs, fish in oil, sugared nuts, and eastern bread still warm when they reached the platters. But he was not merely showing off his city. He was selling a proposal. Pentos wanted a lane to Vesper Keys, not just merchants, but curated traffic, performers, composers, tutors, lettered entertainers, singers, players, and those refined social figures who make an island feel like the center of a world rather than a remote possession. Heru, he said, could offer more practical value. Caravans, fine-crafted wares, oils, dyes, certain rare animals, and quiet inland exchange that did not need to pass through louder harbors every time. The Maiden Plains were more delicate to discuss, so Bracharo handled them in the Pentoshi way, with half the truth polished into politeness. He described them as lands of pleasure houses, trained companions, exotic service courts, and cultivated beauty, a place where nobles, merchants, and envoys were entertained to a standard the West had not yet learned to manage properly. Torrhen let him speak. Elmar of Wintertown stood behind and to one side, expression unreadable, while the king listened with the look he often wore when men thought they were widening his imagination but were really only giving him inventory. For 2 weeks, Torrhen moved through Pentos in layers. Daylight belonged to visible business, harbour surveys, guild receptions, viewings of estates, tower roads, theatre yards, temple streets, bazaars, and formal talks, with magisters who dressed their greed in urban courtesy better than most senators in Crown Hill ever managed. Night belonged to the subtler side, supper in walled manses, music in enclosed gardens, smaller map sessions, private introductions, and long exchanges where men said what they truly wanted only after the 3rd cup, and only if they believed the candles were low enough. Back in Crown Hill, the absence produced exactly the noise Torrhen expected. A portion of the Senate had begun muttering that too much coin was already going north, roads, holds, timber, winter garrisons, engineers, supply yards, and that the East now threatened to become another mouth on the treasury before the northern line had even been settled. Lord Corwin Darry handled that unrest with a steadier hand than most had guessed he possessed. He did not beg them into calm. He read the accounts, separated frontier spending from exploratory spending, delayed the noisiest objections into committee review, and reminded them that a king learning Pentos from inside its walls cost less than a king blundering into Eastern politics blind. Those reports reached Torren while he was already deep into Pentoshi company, and they did not trouble him much. He had come east to learn culture as much as treaties. Pentos was not merely a city to tax or overawe. It was a model of how a place could turn performance into influence and hospitality into leverage. That mattered now, especially with Vesper Keys still young. If the island was to grow into what Torren intended, then Pentos could help teach the crown what to import, what to imitate, what to improve, and what to keep firmly under Western discipline, rather than letting it drift into foreign habit. It was during the 8th night that the conversation he would remember longest took place. Bratero had arranged a supper in a sea-facing manse, smaller than the great receptions, richer in taste, and guarded more quietly. There Torren was introduced to a Pentoshi woman called Niravael, not a princess, not a courtesan in the cheap sense, but a cultivated woman from a merchant Magisteel family branch that had lost some formal standing and gained freedom from it. She spoke both bastard Valyrian and the Western tongue with precision, understood harbor customs, knew music and poetry well enough to host a table, and possessed the rarer gift of speaking to a ruler without flattening herself into flattery. Their first exchange was not about beauty or charm. It was about islands. Nyra asked him why a king who had only just secured his inheritance would spend time on a half-sleeping island off Tarth, instead of raising another palace in Crown Hill where the realm could admire it. Torren answered that admiration was easy to buy in capitals and difficult to control there. She replied that control brought too openly rots into resentment, while influence earned in private sometimes lasts for generations. That answer made Elmar glance once toward the king, not in alarm, but in recognition that this woman was not being wasted on supper talk. From there the conversation widened. Nira spoke of Pentos as a city where song, theatre, feasts, companionship, and rumor all moved in the same invisible market. A foolish ruler, she said, pays for entertainers and thinks he has bought diversion. A serious ruler watches who the entertainers know, who sits beside them, who becomes careless around them, who follows them after the feast, and which names begin appearing too often in the same rooms. Torren listened without interrupting. She was describing something he had already begun sensing at Vesper Keys, only in Pentos it had been refined for centuries. He asked her what kind of place Vesper Keys should become if it were not to fail. She said it should never feel like a prison for guests, nor like a public resort open to every fool with enough silver. It should feel selected. Arrival should matter. Rooms should differ in rank and secrecy. The roads between one villa and another should be easy for those invited and difficult for those merely curious. Temples should lend gravity. Baths should soften the mind. Music should be present but not constant. Water should be seen from most important chambers, and every host who works there should know not only how to serve wine or arrange company, but how to remember what was said, what was promised, and what was avoided. That was the moment Torren understood she belonged to the future of the island, even if neither of them named it yet. He did not ask her to leave Pentos that night or the next. He was not collecting ornaments. He was identifying utility. Over the remaining days of the visit, Nyra appeared 3 more times, once at a harbour promenade, once at a performance court, once at a smaller supper with only Brasharo, Elmar, and 2 Pentoshi factors present. Each time she revealed another useful layer: knowledge of household training, connections to singers and hostesses from respectable and less respectable circles, familiarity with import routes for perfumes, silks, carved stone, musicians, and private tutors, and, most useful of all, the instinct for how to make elite company feel chosen without letting it become unruly. Brocaro saw what was happening and did not interfere. In fact, he encouraged it in his own sly fashion. If Pentoshi culture and Pentoshi social craft found a place at Vesper Keys, then Pentos itself would gain a foothold there without needing to fly banners over the island. So by the end of the second week, the outlines of an understanding had been reached. Heru would explore a protected trade lane toward the island. Pentos would supply selected artists, singers, stage masters, musicians, and cultured household staff when called upon. The Maiden Plains would not be opened recklessly, but certain older houses there might provide adult companions, hostesses, and managers suited to refined courts, subject always to crown screening, not Pentoshi whim. When Torin departed, he left Pentos without conquest and without submission, which was precisely the correct result. He had not gone there to seize it. He had gone there to read it. He left having learned how its wealth moved, how its magisters masked power behind ceremony, how Braccaro Barerian thought, what Heru and the Maiden Plains could offer, and how a woman like Naira Vael could help turn Vesper Keys from a promising island project into a true seat of access, pleasure, culture, and controlled information. The ship West carried more than gifts and letters when it left the Bay of Pentos. It carried the beginnings of a new court language, one that would not be spoken first in the Senate halls or the war tents, but in villas, bath courts, shrine lanes, harbour dinners, and the chosen company of those who understood that power is often strongest where it does not need to shout. High King Torin did not leave Pentos in the mood of a conqueror. Almost 2 weeks among magisters, harbourmen, tiled manses, cultivated voices, and guarded feasts had sharpened his eye, rather than softened it, and when he turned from the gate city into the eastern provinces he carried that sharpened eye with him. He had learned enough in Pentos to understand that the east could not be ruled by steel alone, yet once the harbours gave way to the harder belt beyond, he also saw how quickly refinement ended and frontier truth began. The roads widened, then broke. The stone changed colour. The watchtowers lost their polish. The Eastern Crown settlement stood real enough, but they stood inside a larger country still watching to see whether the new High King meant to hold, bargain, prune, or retreat. Elmar of Wintertown stayed close in that first stretch, riding beside the king through dust, heat, and crown patrol lanes while scribes, interpreters, captains, and local speakers fed Torin the names that mattered most. Tolos, Hasdan, Oros, Garteries, Velos, Valyria. Men left each campfire that week with the same feeling. The king was not wandering the east, he was reading it. His first serious stop was Tolos, where the regional king of the crown and of the eastern marches. Alan Storm came out to meet him under crown standards, and the older storm banners Geralt had raised in that hot wind years before. Alan still looked the part, broad across the chest, seasoned by command, browned by the sun, marked more by rule than by age itself. Yet Torin could also see what long distance from the center does to a man, how it hardens him, narrows him, and slowly teaches him to think like the country he governs. Their talk was not held before a cheering square. Torin wanted the truth, so he heard Alin in a quieter chamber with Elmar of Wintertown, 2 scribes, and a single marcher captain left inside the door. He asked him plainly how long he believed he could still hold the eastern marches at full weight, not for pride, but in fact. Alin gave a soldier's answer first, that he could hold as long as required. Torin did not smile at it. He told him that was not what he had asked, then laid out the real choice: remain in the office for another fixed term, return west with honor and reward, or keep the crown and style, while a younger hand slowly took more of the active burden. Alin did not answer that day, and Torin respected him more for that silence than he would have for easy words. From Tolos the king pushed farther toward Oros, and there the eastern lane took on more of its long shape. Sir Morin Hightower of Oldtown still stood where Geralt had left him, not as some forgotten southern relic, but as a functioning piece of the whole, crown castellan, road steward, and keeper of an inland hinge that had grown more important with every season. Oros itself no longer felt like a mere stop between better places. It had become one of those rough, useful towns empire creates, cisterns cut deeper into the stone, wagon yards fenced tighter, Storage courts watched day and night, scales standardized under crown oversight, and just enough market life around it to prove that men expected tomorrow to arrive there. Sir Morin Hightower received the king with exact courtesy, then spoke with the dryness of a man too old for performance. He said the roads were holding, the merchants still came, the local notables still bowed when it mattered, but the East had begun breeding new little ambitions in every crack between the larger powers. He also gave the king the first clean picture of the season. Sarner had pushed its newer king's presence closer, without yet overstepping the road belt. The men of valor were still visible farther inland, and had not lost their discipline, and a rogue Stormcrow band that tried to carve a petty kingdom out of garteries had already been beaten back before it could root itself. King Torrin listened without interruption, then spent the next morning riding the Oros roads himself, letting the town and the men around it show him what Sir Morin Hightower already knew. Garteries remained one of the great unsettled names in the region, and Torrin treated it that way. The news he received there was not of a new war, but of a near miss. A rogue Stormcrow force had indeed tried to make the castle into a private toll seat after Geralt's departure, betting that distance from Crown Hill meant opportunity. Instead, they had been bloodied by a harder Sarnori response than expected, and the castle now sat under Sarnori influence, not warmly allied to the crown, but not yet bent toward open challenge either. Torrin did not ride there to start a border war for pride. He studied the position from a ridge, heard the local readings, and accepted that some pieces on the eastern board could remain where they were so long as they served as buffers instead of sparks. Beyond that, the men of valor still had their own presence in the wider region, not in the loose fashion of raiders, but in the manner of a people who intended to be counted as a force. Their camps were not close enough to threaten the king's escort, yet close enough to matter. Their discipline alone was warning enough. King Torrin left that stretch with the answer he wanted. The East was still alive with military possibility, but nothing in front of him required foolish haste. Velos Island proved the real test of the chapter. Torrin had heard enough by then to know its worth. Small harbor potential, lookout value, quarry stone, anchorage, customs reach, and future use if the crown wanted a clean island position that was not yet tied too tightly to the louder rival powers. He refused to simply plant a banner and call it law. Instead, he learned the local truth that Velos still lay under old maritime rights held by a wealthy associate owner whose coin had outlived governments and whose paper claims were annoying enough to matter. The first meeting took place aboard a galley moored off a broken quay, then resumed in a half-ruined customs house where salt had climbed the walls and old seals still clung to cracked plaster. The High King of the Crownlands offered a lawful purchase, crown silver, future protections, and status for the man's line in future agreements if the island passed cleanly. The man wanted more. Too much silver, a permanent cut of harbor income, restrictions on royal fortification, and protections broad enough to keep his own sea traffic half hidden under crown peace. King Torrin declined without anger. The talks ended with courtesy intact and no deal signed, which frustrated some of his men, but not the king. In truth, the failed negotiation only made Velos more important, since it had now passed from rumor into policy, from a place on a map into an island with a price, an owner, and a future struggle attached to it. The road into Balon Blackfire's country changed the air before it changed the view. Oros and the Marcher Belt still felt governable in ordinary ways, but the farther east Torrin rode, the more the world began to look broken and somehow still in use at the same time. Old cuts in the stone showed where roads had once run wider than any the Westerosi had built. Half-collapsed terraces held unexpected life. Smoke rose where ruins should have been empty. Then, by late afternoon under a pale, hard sky, the first shadow crossed the ground too slowly and too heavily to be cloud. Men looked up. Horses tightened. Segar was circling above the broken interior, red against the washed light, old and broad and deliberate, not racing, not showing off, but making himself known before he came down. King Torran watched him in silence. The dragon widened once, twice, then lowered with a weight that could be felt before it fully landed. Dust rolled out from the settling body. Heat moved in a breath over the waiting party. The beast's neck showed old scar lines. The head was heavy, the eyes watchful rather than frenzied, and the whole posture of Sagar told Torrhen what he needed to know at once. This was not a court beast, nor a chained city terror, but an old war creature that had lasted. Balon Blackfire came forward properly after the landing, and the High King noticed that first, too. He did not swagger toward a king, as though Dragonfire erased rank, and he did not abase himself either. He bowed with form, respect, and the dignity of a man who had lost much without surrendering himself entirely. The banners behind him drew King Torrhen's eye almost as quickly as the dragon had. They were not the black and red standard a Western lord expected from the Blackfire sound of the name. These were white and red, bright even in the broken light, and they looked strange enough in that ruined country to hold the eye. King Torrhen asked about them before he asked anything else. Balon Blackfire answered without shame. Whitefire, he called it, the sign of an Essosi bastard branch, of a bastard-born Targaryen offshoot, a mark not of accepted inheritance, but of survival made into identity. Torrhen did not mock the explanation, and did not praise it too easily, which Balon Blackfire noticed at once. After that, the meeting began in earnest. Balon thanked the crown for earlier protection and toleration under Gerald, then made it clear that gratitude did not mean he mistook his own position. He lived only by strength, caution, utility, and the fact that stronger men had not yet decided his extinction was worth the cost. The High King rode with him into the operable pocket of Valyria, and what he found there was more real than Western rumor had made it. Not a thriving old empire reborn, not some shining impossibility, but a living holdfast carved out of ruin by discipline and patience. There were guarded staff quarters set into older stone, workshops kept small and useful, cistern lines repaired just enough to function, terraces with families moving quietly between them, storage halls, penned animals, watchfires, and a population large enough to surprise any man who had imagined the place empty. Just over or under 1,000 souls by the look of it, perhaps a little less in one season, a little more in another, enough to make it a community and not a camp. Torrhen saw children, handlers, old retainers, scribes, laborers, and armed men who carried themselves like people defending a future rather than simply waiting for death. Balon showed him all this with careful pride. He wanted the king to see that Valyria, or at least this portion of it, was not only a nest for dragon and exiles, but a working pocket that could still be improved, fed, traded with, and made useful if not overreached. Only after that tour did the harder talk begin. Balon Blackfire told Torrhen that Arion of Astapor still believed he had been part of a court plot to usurp him, a bloody business that left 2 officials and an Astapori woman dead. Balon denied it outright. In his version, Arion of Astapor had grown paranoid, and the root of that paranoia was simple. Balon had become too visible, too liked, and too dangerous in the eyes of a ruler who could not forget that only 2 dragon riders remained within that political world. Torrhen heard him out in a stone chamber open to the evening air, Sagar visible now and then beyond the terrace as the beast shifted at rest. Balon did not plead innocence like a frightened boy. He spoke like a man who knew innocence mattered less than perception, once a ruler decided a rival's shadow had grown too long. He also gave Torrhen the wider picture he had ridden east to learn. Astapor remained powerful. Volantis still moved through money and clients, and the Dothraki were not a neat kingdom to be reasoned with, but a field of mounted threat that could descend fast on weakly held places. That, more than pride, was why Balon Blackfire believed dragon power still mattered in the east, not to burn every challenge away, but to make rival powers stop and measure before they moved. King Torrhen accepted that logic, though not for free. When he finally spoke terms, he did so as High King, not as a fascinated visitor among old stones. Balon Blackfire could continue under crown favor. He could trade with the crown directly, and eventually, by straight-shot ship lane, once the Vesper Keys system was ready to receive and regulate that commerce. Valyria would not become an unbound private fief floating in the king's larger sea. It would trade with the crown, and the crown with it. In return, Balon Blackfire would answer when called for dragon support as far west as the Stepstones Lane, if the crown required it, keep his dealings aligned first with royal interests where possible, and admit crown engineers under seal to inspect selected ruins, harbours, and workable sites for improvement. Balon did not accept in one eager breath. Torrhen would not have trusted that if he had. They worked the edges of it. Who would inspect first? What zones would remain closed? What obligations counted as summons? How much freedom Balon Blackfire retained inside his own white-fire-marked pocket, and where crown oversight ended short of humiliation? By the time the terms settled into shape, both men understood the truth of it. Torrhen was not rescuing him. He was binding him. Balon was not kneeling into slavery. He was choosing a greater structure over isolation and eventual extinction. When King Torrhen rode back westward from that Valyrian pocket, he left without a new war, and with more than one new peace set in motion. Alan Storm of the Eastern Marches had a decision before him and now knew the king would force truth where flatterers preferred comfort. Sir Morin Hightower still held Oros in sober order, which meant the hinge had not slipped. Garteries remained a watched buffer rather than a fresh wound. Velos had not been bought, but it had entered the reign as a living question, and questions like that had a way of returning larger each season they were left unresolved. Most of all, Balon Blackfire had stepped fully into Torrhen's age under the eyes of Sagar, and beneath the white and red Whitefire standard, not as a rumour at the edge of Gerald's old conquests, but as a real eastern power pocket that might one day help hold the provinces together when Volantis, Astapor, or some mounted eastern storm tested them again. Torrhen did not need to say any of that aloud on the road back. The men riding with him could already feel it. The East had not pulled him into its wars. It had shown him the shape of the next ones. When the High King returned to Crown Hill, he did not come back in triumph colours. He came back in travel-worn maroon, dust still caught in the hems, salt still lingering in the leather, and that alone told the Senate this would not be one of their easier afternoons. The court filled early, old robe-men, younger house envoys, trade voices from the harbour, military clerks, tax speakers, and the richer senators who had already heard enough rumour to know the East had come home with the king whether they liked it or not. Corwin Darry stood in his place as hand and watched the chamber settle without needing to silence it himself. Torrhen let them look at him first, let them take his measure, then rose and told them plainly that the East had not returned to him as a fantasy of open land and easy tribute. It had returned as a contest of roads, ports, islands, rival courts, old empires in new clothes, and sea lanes that would one day decide whether Crown Hill ruled outward or merely dreamed that it did. He began with Velos, which drew the first stir across the benches. King Torrhen told them he had not simply walked onto the island and called it lawful. He had found title, paper, money, and old maritime rights, wrapped around it by an associate holder, rich enough to demand more than courtesy, and shrewd enough to understand what the crown wanted. That mattered, Torrhen said, since Velos was not a lonely rock to flatter mapmakers. It was a future signal point, anchorage, customs station, quarry, and watch island set in the line between the Crown's present holdings and the next generation of Eastern movement. Then he gave them the hard part. The first purchase attempt had failed. Not from insult, not from hatred, but from price, terms, and the knowledge that the other side had begun to understand its leverage. So he put the question before the Senate, with the sharpness of a king who had already made up his mind. Better to borrow now, and buy a key, than bleed later, trying to wrench one from hostile hands. That opened the money fight exactly as Torrhen knew it would. One senator from the western benches asked whether the Crown meant to borrow silver for every pretty island that caught a royal eye. Another asked how many more eastern gates the realm would be told it could not live without. A third tried the safer road and wondered aloud whether Velos could simply wait. Torrhen answered each one in turn without raising his voice. He said the Crown had already learned in Geralt's day that roads and sea lanes become more expensive after rival powers fortify them. Not before. He reminded them that Tolos, Oros, and the belt beyond had been worth holding only once the realm understood how fast distance becomes weakness when ships cannot anchor where they should, and garrisons cannot be fed when they must. Then he set Velos inside the larger map, so even the duller men in the room could see it. The island was not important alone. Not yet. It was important in relation to the Eastern Sea, to Vesper Keys later, to the Valyrian region, to Stepstone's traffic, and to the Crown's ability to get information and keep a lawful hand on its own widening world. From there he moved beyond Velos, and into the larger fear he had brought back with him. Crown spies in Pentos, harbour listeners, hired tongues, and men who sold information to stay alive had all returned with the same message. The Eastern powers were not sleeping. The Dothraki was still no single throne that could be reasoned with, yet new movements across the grass and the waste suggested pressure gathering in waves rather than accidents, which meant weak places would be struck first and fast. Farther out, Yiti was being spoken of less as a distant marvel and more as a rising imperial market state, broad in trade, disciplined in court, increasingly confident at sea, and patient enough to bind ports and rulers through profit before binding them through force. Torrhen said it plainly. If the Far East continued to weld commerce to shipbuilding and shipbuilding to state ambition, then one day the western end of Essos would wake to find the eastern end already in motion against it. That drew a colder silence than the money question had, since even the fattest senators understood a rich rival across the sea is more dangerous than a loud one on horseback. Korth came next, and there Torrhen gave the chamber something grand enough to hold its imagination. He described it not as a tale from a sailor's cup, but as a power at the Jade Gates, a city-state of merchants, oligarchs, guilds, and fleets, whose position made it a bridge between east and west, north and south, and whose rulers understood tolls, passage, and sea control better than many kings understood land. The estimates he laid before the Senate were not treated as holy numbers, only as the best royal reading available, a Korthian field and garrison strength in the range of 50 to 60,000, when its civic guard, allied bodies, port forces, camel corps, and hired auxiliaries were counted together. He did not say Korth intended to invade tomorrow. He said something worse, that a city so placed, so rich, and so experienced in guarding the hinge between seas did not need to conquer everything itself to shape the future of entire regions. Then he turned west again and spoke of the newly reborn Giscari kingdom, another force gathering old identity into new scale, perhaps 20 to 30,000 under arms, if current reports held, nourished by memory of empire, slave wealth, and the ancient Giscari habit of imagining the world as something once theirs and perhaps not lost forever. That was the point where the chamber began to feel the real weight of the afternoon. Torrhen was not telling them bedtime terrors from the Sunrise Lands. He was telling them that the Eastern world had begun thinking in blocks, in ports, in passage rights, in armies large enough to dominate regions, and in old names revived for new crowns. Volantis still mattered. Astapor still mattered. Arian of Astapor still sat over a disciplined Eastern war system, Balon, Blackfire, and Sagar had shown the Crown another kind of Eastern answer: speed, deterrence, and a force that made enemies think twice before lunging at soft provinces. Yet dragons alone could not solve everything. Torrhen said that too. A dragon can protect distance faster than ships and banners can, but no dragon can replace harbors, roads, alliances, paid crews, lawful ownership, and islands secured before rivals do the securing themselves. So when he returned again to the borrowing question, he did not speak of it as spending for vanity. He spoke of it as the price of not waking one morning to discover the Crown had allowed richer and farther powers to close their hand over the routes that should have remained open. The Senate did what Senates do when forced to hear the future in the voice of a man they cannot easily ignore. Some men muttered about debt, some about overreach, some tried to recast the whole matter as one king's Eastern fascination. Corwin Darry let them spend that noise for a little while, then began the hand's work, steadying the lanes of discussion, breaking cost into terms, borrowing into instruments, and the Velos question into something the chamber could either fund or be remembered for refusing. Torrhen did not overstay the debate. He had brought them truth, scale, and urgency. Corwin Darry would now bring them structure. When the session finally broke and the benches began to thin, the rich men left talking in tighter knots than they had entered with, which suited the king perfectly. He remained at the front a moment longer, one hand on the carved back of his seat, then told the guards to clear the upper floor and asked Corwin Darry to stay. The hall changed after that. Pages withdrew. Scribes were dismissed. The last murmur of senatorial cloth faded up the marble passageways until only the king, the hand, and the deeper evening of Crown Hill remained. Torrhen looked down toward the empty chamber, where men had just argued over islands, armies, and eastern futures, as though they were numbers in neat rows. Then he turned to Corwin Darry, with the look of a man ready to stop speaking for the room, and start speaking only to the one man in it he needed to understand him fully. After the Senate emptied, High King Torrhen remained at the front of the chamber while the last robe hems and sandal steps faded into the upper passages. Crown Hill felt different once the audience was gone. The bronze braziers still burned, the marble still reflected torchlight, and the carved senators' benches still stood in their ordered rows, but the noise had left the room and taken all its false confidence with it. Corwin Darry stayed where he had been told to stay, one hand resting on the table below the king's platform, reading the silence before he spoke into it. High King Torrhen waited until the guards had cleared the upper gallery and checked the side doors twice before he came down from his seat and stood on the same level as his hand. He asked the question first in the plainest way possible. Which men in that room had argued from fear, and which men had argued from design? Corwin Darry answered him the way a good hand should, not with 10 names thrown out for effect, but with classes of danger. A few senators were truly worried about debt. A few were frightened by how large the East now sounded when spoken aloud in Crown Hill. A few had already begun quietly telling one another that northern roads, eastern islands, and dragons in ruined provinces were the appetites of a king who intended to outgrow his chamber. Then there was the more useful category, the men who had not decided anything yet, and could still be bound by advantage, office, or survival, if moved on quickly enough. High King Torrhen paced once along the lower aisle and asked whether Corwin Darry believed the chamber could turn from muttering into conspiracy. Corwin Darry said yes, but not all at once and not under one banner. It would begin the way such things always begin, with private suppers, offended men calling themselves guardians of balance, reach and Western coin drifting into the same rooms, and one older senator persuading himself that the king's ambition had become a public danger that required discreet correction. That did not mean knives would appear tomorrow, but it meant the atmosphere had changed. Ashara of Winterfell had already helped prove as much. Over the last stretch of Eastern correspondence, she had been moved closer into the hand's working circle, first as a northern reader of reports and names, then more openly as one of the few in Crown Hill who could sort cold country truth from southern performance. and she had begun quietly marking which letters came clean, and which had been written for a second audience beyond the desk. That was when King Torrhen stopped walking and looked back at Corwin Darry more sharply. He asked whether Ashara of Winterfell was steady enough for deeper use, and Corwin Darry said she was, perhaps more useful than some of the polished men already around him. She did not talk too much, did not frighten at rank, and did not treat every whisper as if it deserved to become policy. She listened, remembered, and noticed when men changed their tone depending on who had entered the room. Corwin Darry said that, in Crown Hill, those habits were worth more than pretty speech. High King Torrhen accepted that, without further performance, and told his hand to keep her close, not as a public favourite, not yet, but as part of the machine that would now be needed more than ever. From there the talk moved to the question beneath every other question, money. King Torrhen asked how much strain the crown could carry before even loyal men began using the word burden instead of investment. Corwin Darry laid it out cleanly. The realm could keep the crown lands strong, continue northern work, and maintain the eastern belt, but not forever on confidence alone. Velos made the problem more obvious, not only as a purchase, but as a signal, since every rival power would see what the crown chose to do when faced with a lawful claim it wanted badly. If High King Torrhen paid too much, his critics would say he had been led by the nose. If he refused too soon, they would say his eastern policy had no stomach once price was attached to principle. If he borrowed, then the next question would no longer be whether the crown wanted Velos, but from whom it was willing to take coin to get it. That opened the deeper concern between them. Braavos had already shown interest through quieter lanes, not only in trade, but in structure, debt, repayment, and controlled influence over developing corridors. High King Torrhen asked the question as a king who already knew half the answer. If Braavos lent the money, would Braavos be buying entry rather than offering help? Corwin Darry said yes. Of course it would. The only question was whether the crown could shape the entry point tightly enough that the island was purchased without the sea around it becoming partly Braavosi in practice. He had begun sketching the possible forms already: fixed-term lending, customs percentages capped by years rather than generations, repayment from designated eastern duties rather than broad crown receipts, and absolute refusal on any clause that touched sovereignty or permanent garrison rights. The king listened to all of it, then told his hand something closer to instinct than policy. He would take debt before he took humiliation, but he would not let Crown Hill become a client in its own waters. Before they could press farther, one of the side captains entered, bowed, and said the Braavosi had arrived. Not a banker sent in common clothes, not a nameless money man trying to pass as a merchant, but a formal figure from the banker kingdom's political lane, one of the Sea Republic's senatorial officers, dressed in dark layered blue with silver clasps, and the kind of measured posture that said his city expected to be heard before kings without having to beg for the privilege. High King Torrhen did not answer at once. He looked once to Corwin Darry, who gave the smallest nod, then ordered the man admitted and the side doors closed behind him. The Braavosi entered with 2 attendants only, placed a lacquered case on the long table, and began with courtesy sharp enough to feel rehearsed. He said Braavos had listened with great interest to the crown's eastern reading, to the question of Velos, and to the larger danger of leaving key islands in uncertain hands while older and richer powers arranged the sea around them. Then he offered what he called partnership, coin enough to secure the purchase if terms could be reached, in exchange for structured repayment, inspection rights over the harbour accounts once the island entered crown use, and a negotiated share of future profit tied not to the island's title, but to its productive output. Corwin Darry said nothing at first, which was wise. He let High King Torrhen hear the shape of the trap before either of them named it. The Braavosi senator continued, calm and professional, saying Braavos had no wish to own Velos, only to help place it into reliable hands while sharing in the security and prosperity such an acquisition would generate. He even spoke the larger game aloud: Carthian scale, Giscari revival, Eastern fleets, Dothraki motion, and the danger of slow Western rulers learning the price of delay only when it doubled. High King Torin asked him one question in return, and asked it so directly that even the attendants felt it. If Braavos lent the money, what would Braavos believe it had bought besides interest? The Braavosi senator smiled only enough to show he had expected the king to reach that point quickly, then answered that in the East, wise powers do not buy islands, they buy position. That line settled the room. High King Torin did not dismiss the man, and he did not accept him. He told him the crown would hear terms in full on the next day, with Corwin Darry present, with the ledgers and limits written properly, and with no assumption that Velos could be entered through crown need and then quietly managed for Braavosi advantage afterward. The senator bowed, unoffended, and said Braavos preferred exactness anyway. When he was gone, and the doors were barred again, Corwin Darry let out the breath he had been holding, and said the obvious thing at last. Braavos had come faster than expected. High King Torin looked down at the lacquered case left on the table, then passed it toward the darkened seats of the Senate. He said no, not faster than expected, only more openly than expected. Then he told Corwin Darry to prepare for the Braavosi session at dawn, to bring a Shara of Winterfell into the document lane before sunrise, and to send a separate sealed order eastward. King Alan Storm was to be quietly recalled toward Crown Hill with full dignity and no public explanation. If the eastern marches were changing hands, the realm would not announce that fact until the king was ready for everyone else to feel. Dawn found Crown Hill colder than the night before, not in weather, but in mood. The Braavosi had been given their second audience before most of the city had even broken bread, and that alone told the inner court how seriously High King Torin meant to take the matter. Corwin Darry was already in place when the king entered, ledgers stacked, wax markers set, harbour maps unrolled beside the eastern seaboard, and a Shara of Winterfell standing a little behind the hand's shoulder with a packet of copied notes tied in dark cord. She did not look out of place there anymore. That change had happened quietly, which was usually the safest kind. The Braavosi delegation arrived in deep blue again, cleaner and sharper than the day before, bringing not only the senator but 2 money readers, a legal man, and 1 silent observer whose job was almost certainly to remember what had been conceded and what had merely been performed. High King Torin took his seat, let the room settle, then said they would begin with the only question that mattered, what Braavos believed it was truly buying when it offered coin for Velos. The answer came in layers, which was Braavosi enough. First they spoke of security, lawful transfer, and shared confidence in a stabilized island. Then they spoke of repayment, duties, and managed harbor income. Then at last, they came to the real language beneath the polished one, access, predictability, and early preference in the Eastern Sea. Corwin Darry made them define every phrase. A Shara of Winterfell noted each answer, then quietly slid corrections toward the hand whenever a Braavosi word grew too soft around the edges. The Crown would not permit sovereignty to be touched. The Crown would not grant permanent harbour inspection without term limits. The Crown would not bind future fortification rights to foreign approval. By the middle of the audience, the Braavosi senator had stopped speaking to the chamber, as though it were a room of dazzled provincials, and started speaking to it as a room that understood exactly how expensive clever language becomes once signed. High King Torin said very little during that stretch, which made the delegation more careful than any shouted threat would have. By the end of the first sitting, the shape of a possible agreement had emerged, though not a final one. Braavos would lend the Crown a defined sum rather than an open line of credit. Repayment would come from designated Eastern customs over a fixed run of years. Profit sharing would be capped and tied only to declared commercial output from Velos, not to the island's law, defense, or title. No Braavosi garrison would set foot there by right. No private fleet clause would be allowed to grow under the wording. A limited accounting presence could be discussed, but only under Crown Seal, Crown Review, and Crown Revocation if terms were abused. The senator did not love those restrictions, though he was too disciplined to show offense. He said Braavos preferred arrangements that rewarded trust. Corwin Darry replied that Crown Hill preferred arrangements that survived trust failing. High King Torrin let that line sit in the room a moment, then ended the session for the day with neither acceptance nor refusal. That was enough to tell every man present that the island was now moving from desire into machinery. When the Bravosi withdrew, the room did not empty fully this time. Ashara of Winterfell remained, and Torrin asked her to stay nearer rather than step back. That small gesture was noticed by Corwin Darry at once, and by Ashara herself only after a breath. The king asked what she had seen that the others might have missed. She answered plainly. The moneymen were not the most dangerous part of the Bravosi offer. The most dangerous part was how calmly they assumed the crown would accept long Eastern dependence once the first debt was taken. They were not treating Velos as a single transaction. They were treating it as a door. Corwin Darry gave her a look that was almost approval, and said that was exactly right. High King Torren then told Ashara of Winterfell she would move from copied report work into active review of Eastern agreements, port language, and foreign clauses, not as a public officer yet, but as part of the Hand's close reading circle. Ashara accepted with a northern steadiness that pleased him more than enthusiasm would have. She understood enough already to know that in Crown Hill, being brought closer to power was not the same thing as being made safer. The next development came before noon, when the Eastern courier reached the city with word that King Alan Storm of the Eastern Marches had obeyed the recall without protest, and was already west of the belt, traveling under full honors with a stripped escort rather than an army train. That detail mattered. It told Torrin two things at once. First, that Alan still understood obedience to the center, and second, that he had chosen dignity over theater. Corwin Darry asked whether the city should be prepared for an official announcement. Torrin said no. Let him arrive first. Let the court see him. Let the Senate wonder. If a man like Alan Storm came back from the east and no one yet knew who had replaced him, that uncertainty itself had use. It would keep the chamber from pretending the marches were a solved question while the crown was in transition. Then the king added the part that made Corwin Darry look at him more closely. When Alan arrived, he was to be housed close to the royal compound and measured quietly for crown guard black and maroon, with no title stripped and no explanation offered until the king chose the hour. That afternoon the east gave way to the north in Torrin's mind, which was the larger turn the rain had been approaching for some time. The Senate had heard the map. Braavos had shown its hand. Velos was moving into debt and law territory. Alan Storm was coming home. That meant the king could now leave the capital again without seeming to flee from the argument. He met with Corwin Darry a second time in a smaller chamber, this one used for travel scheduling, campaign inheritance roles, and the sort of work that shapes history before history notices it has been shaped. They spoke of Moat Cailin, of river grain, of storehouse timber, of Northern Road hardening before the next bad season, of garrisons that had become too comfortable, and of which castles would need the king's eyes rather than another stack of letters. Torrin said the north would now be taken in sequence, not as one grand dramatic ride, but as a chain of inspections, judgments, and visible rule. He would not rush to Winterfell as though that one name alone mattered. He would move the line properly: causeway, holdfast, store station, river point, castle, then the larger seats beyond. That was how the north would feel him, as structure first and personality second. Word began to spread through Crown Hill by evening that the High King was preparing for another journey, though only the inner ring understood its direction. Senators assumed he might retreat into the harbour business, or bury himself in Bravosi terms. Harbour men guessed he would remain to press the Velos question harder. Instead, the royal yard started sorting winter wagons, hard cloaks, pack mules, and survey poles. Northern riders were called inward. Road captains were told to have their counts ready. Ashara of Winterfell remained behind with Corwin Darry, now more visibly part of the Hand's work, while scribes began copying route packets for the king's northern progress. And somewhere on the western road, King Alan Storm of the Eastern Marches rode toward Crown Hill with the east still on his boots, and the future of his office already changed, though no proclamation had yet told the realm what that change would be. So the chapter ended with 3 lines tightening at once. Braavos had placed coin on the table, but not yet won the island. The East had sent one of its hardest royal men back to the center, and the center had not explained why. The North, long spoken of in letters and disputes, was about to become visible again in chronological order. 1 station, 1 fortress, 1 judgment at a time. High King Torrhen had spent the better part of the year learning how wide his realm had become. Now he would begin the harder labor of showing every part of it that the width still belonged to one crown.